Flight 323 was cruising smoothly at 35,000 feet when the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. I had been half asleep, my cheek pressed against the cold window, lulled by the hum of the engines. His tone was calm, but the words that followed jolted me awake, sending an icy current through my veins. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. There's something on the wing of the plane. Please stay seated." The murmur that spread through the cabin was immediate, a rising tide of confusion and anxiety. I turned my head slowly, glancing out the window. I saw nothing but a thick layer of clouds, dimly lit by the moon, but the nervous whispers from passengers near the wings told a different story. "I swear there's something out there," a man 2 rows ahead muttered, his voice shaking. It moved. My stomach twisted as I leaned in closer to the glass, straining my eyes. Maybe it was just the power of suggestion, but was there something out there? A shadow darker than the night sky? The hairs on my arms stood on end as I fought the urge to dismiss it as a trick of the light. Then the captain's voice came again, but this time it was different. It trembled. "It's inside now. Please remain calm." For a moment the cabin was deathly silent. No one moved, no one spoke. It was as if we all collectively held our breath, waiting for the punchline of some cruel joke. But the joke never came. The lights flickered once, then again, before plunging the cabin into a dim, sickly yellow glow. A faint sound echoed through the aisles, a scraping, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I couldn't see what was making the noise, but I could feel it. That oppressive, suffocating sensation of being watched. My throat tightened, and I suddenly found it hard to breathe. I was terrified to look down the aisle, terrified of what I might see. Then I heard a scream, a short, strangled cry from the back of the plane. A woman. People stood up, twisting in their seats, craning their necks to see what had happened, but the dim lighting made everything feel distorted, unreal. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the walls and ceiling, warping the familiar into something grotesque. The dragging sound grew louder, closer. I swallowed hard, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. There was no flight attendant rushing to calm the woman, no reassuring voice over the intercom. Just that awful dragging sound, and then, as if things couldn't get worse, the plane lurched. Not turbulence, this was different. The entire cabin shuddered violently, throwing people against their seats. Luggage bins popped open, bags spilling into the aisles. The woman screamed again, her voice rising into a hysterical pitch. "It's here," she shrieked. "Oh God, it's here!" I turned around slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. There, at the far end of the cabin, something moved. It was hard to make out in the low light, but I saw it. A figure. It was crouched, twisted in a way that no human could be, its limbs too long, too thin. Its skin was dark, almost blending into the shadows, but its eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow. It moved again, slithering forward, and that awful dragging sound followed it. I felt a surge of nausea rise in my throat. There was something terribly wrong with it, something unnatural. People around me were frozen in shock, some staring wide-eyed, others squeezing their eyes shut, as if refusing to see would make it disappear. But it was real, too real. Suddenly, the plane dropped. The force of the descent slammed me back into my seat, my stomach doing somersaults. The overhead oxygen masks dropped down, swinging like pendulums. The figure, whatever it was, didn't even flinch. It just kept coming, slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. The lights flickered again, and I heard a low, guttural growl, a sound so primal it made my blood run cold. It was coming from the creature. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my seatbelt, tightening it as much as I could. Around me, others were doing the same, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror. Then the intercom crackled to life once more. The captain's voice was barely a whisper, barely human. "Remain calm." The cabin plunged into chaos. Passengers screamed, some tried to run, but the plane was shaking violently now, tossing us around like rag dolls. I clung to my armrests, my knuckles white. The figure was closer now, its glowing eyes locked onto us, unblinking. It was no longer crawling. It stood upright, towering over the seats, its head brushing the ceiling. And then, with horrifying clarity, I saw its face. It was no face at all. Just an empty, yawning darkness where a face should have been. No mouth, no nose, just those awful glowing eyes. My body froze in pure animalistic fear. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. Suddenly, the creature lunged. A man in the aisle stood directly in its path, his face a mask of terror. He didn't even have time to scream before it was on him, its long, spindly arms wrapping around him like a spider trapping its prey. The lights flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I heard the man's body hit the floor with a sickening thud. Panic erupted. People scrambled over seats, pushing and shoving, desperate to get away. But the creature moved faster than anything I'd ever seen. It was inhuman, darting through the aisles, snatching people as it went. Their screams echoed through the cabin, cutting off abruptly. I was shaking so hard I could barely think. My mind raced, desperately trying to come up with something, anything, that would make sense of this. But nothing did. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Yet it was. The plane dropped again, a stomach-churning plummet. And this time the emergency lights flickered on. In the chaos, I caught a glimpse of the cockpit door. It was wide open, the captain was gone, and then I understood. The creature hadn't just been on the wing. It had been inside the cockpit all along. The captain's voice, the calmness, the tremor, it hadn't been him. It had been it. The creature had been playing with us from the start. I barely had time to process this when I heard it again, the dragging, scraping sound. Closer, too close I turned, just in time to see those glowing eyes right in front of me. Then everything went black. There's something unsettling about red-eye flights. The hum of the engines, the dim lights, and the silent, slumbering passengers create a surreal, almost dreamlike atmosphere. I remember thinking that as I boarded Flight 492, a midnight trip across the country, a long, quiet flight, just what I needed after the week I'd had. The plane was only half full, making it easy for me to find a window seat. The lights were already dimmed, and most of the passengers seemed to be dozing off before we even left the ground. I settled in, listening to the soft thrum of the engines, letting the rhythmic sound lull me into a trance. The flight had been smooth, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, about an hour in, something changed. It started as a shift in the atmosphere, a heaviness that I couldn't quite place. I opened my eyes, blinking into the half-darkness. Everything looked the same. People were still slumped in their seats, some with neck pillows, others with blankets pulled up to their chins. The flight attendants had disappeared to the back of the plane. No drink carts in sight. But something was different. I could feel it. Then I saw it. A shadow, larger than any person, started moving down the aisle. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe caused by someone standing or moving. But no one was moving. The passengers were still as statues. Yet, this shadow seemed to glide between the rows, darker than the dim cabin lights, darker than the night itself. I squinted, trying to make out its form, but it had none. It was just an amorphous blotch of darkness, shifting and swaying, like smoke that never dispersed. I sat up straighter, my heart beginning to pound. No one else seemed to notice. Everyone around me was either asleep or too absorbed in their own world to care. The shadow stopped at a row a few seats ahead of me. It lingered there, hovering over a middle-aged man with glasses. He had been reading a book just moments before, but now he was slumped in his seat, his head lolling to one side, the book lying open in his lap. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, glazed over like he'd been frozen mid-thought. A chill ran down my spine. The shadow moved on. I couldn't tear my gaze away. I watched, heart in my throat, as it continued down the aisle, stopping at random seats. Each time it paused, the person in that seat would slump, their eyes glazing over, their bodies going limp as if the life had been sucked right out of them. There was no sound, no struggle, just a quiet, terrifying stillness. Then it stopped at a woman in the middle aisle, 2 rows ahead. She must have felt it because her head snapped up, her eyes darting around in panic. She opened her mouth, but before she could scream, the shadow enveloped her. Her scream was cut off, swallowed by the darkness. Her arms flailed for a second, her body jerking violently, and then she went still. Her head slumped forward, and her hair fell across her face, obscuring her features. I gripped the armrests, my hands clammy. I didn't know what to do. It was like I was glued to my seat, watching this nightmare unfold, unable to move, unable to think. The shadow was closer now, gliding from row to row. It stopped at another passenger, then another. Each time they were left lifeless, slumped in their seats, their eyes dull, like dolls that had been left out in the sun too long. I could feel it now, the weight of it, pressing down on the air, on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The closer it got, the heavier the pressure. It wasn't just the sight of it. It was the feeling of being watched, of something ancient and malevolent bearing down on you. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but the words were stuck in my throat. The shadow was 2 rows behind me now, creeping ever closer. I could hear it, not with my ears, but with some deeper primal part of me. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like a whisper in my mind, a faint distant hum that made my skin crawl. The person in the seat behind me gasped, a man older, maybe in his 60s. I heard him choke, and then nothing. I was next. My heart hammered against my ribs as I glanced frantically around the cabin, searching for any sign of movement, of life. But everyone was slumped in their seats, motionless, their faces pale and blank. The flight attendants hadn't returned. The entire plane felt like a tomb. Then it was upon me. I didn't dare turn around, but I could feel it behind me, that suffocating weight pressing down, cold sweat dripping down the back of my neck. It lingered, just inches away, its presence tangible, like an icy hand gripping my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would move on, praying it wouldn't take me like it had taken the others. My breathing was shallow, ragged. The cabin felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in. And then it moved past me. For a moment I didn't understand. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why had it spared me? I opened my eyes cautiously, my pulse still racing. The shadow was moving down the aisle again, away from me. It stopped at a few more rows, each time leaving passengers slumped and lifeless in its wake. I watched it, heart in my throat, as it reached the end of the cabin and disappeared into the darkness. I sat there frozen, not daring to move. I don't know how long I stayed like that, my hands trembling, my mind spinning. Hours, minutes. Time had lost all meaning. Finally, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please return your seats to the upright position." The plane was landing. Somehow we had made it through the night, but as I looked around the cabin, my stomach twisted with dread. Half the passengers, more than half, were still slumped in their seats, their faces pale, their eyes open but blank, staring ahead like they'd seen something they could never unsee. When the plane touched down, no one moved. There was no rush to gather belongings, no chatter of relief. Just silence. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky, and made my way down the aisle. I passed row after row of motionless passengers, their bodies slack, their faces ghostly. When I stepped off the plane, I realized something even more terrifying. None of them had blinked. Not once. And as I walked into the airport, leaving the shadow behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't just passed through the plane. It had taken something from me, too. I had always hated long flights. The feeling of being trapped in a metal tube at 35,000 feet was bad enough. But something about the way time stretched and warped while you were in the air unsettled me. Still, when my job required me to take a transcontinental flight from New York to Tokyo, I didn't have much of a choice. The flight began as uneventfully as any other. I boarded, stowed my bag in the overhead bin, and settled into my window seat near the middle of the plane. We were flying on one of those newer jets, big, sleek, the kind that felt more like a hotel lobby in the sky. The cabin was filled with a low murmur of conversations and the occasional hiss of overhead vents. The crew, a group of 5 flight attendants, moved efficiently through the aisles. I distinctly remembered them because they'd been so friendly during the boarding process, greeting each passenger as we filed in. There was the older woman with short gray hair who had offered to help with my bag, a tall guy with a ponytail, and 3 other attendants, each wearing the same warm smile as they guided passengers to their seats. The flight had been in the air for about 3 hours when I noticed something strange. There were fewer flight attendants. I'd called for some water, and when one of the attendants came by, It was the woman with short gray hair, the one who had helped me earlier. As she handed me the bottle, I suddenly realized that I hadn't seen the tall guy with the ponytail in quite a while. I brushed it off at first. Maybe he was on break, or maybe I just hadn't been paying attention. But as I scanned the aisles, I realized I could only see 2 flight attendants, including the gray-haired woman. I thought back to boarding, counting again in my head. 5. There had definitely been 5. Maybe I was mistaken. I turned to the gray-haired woman as she was about to walk away. "Excuse me," I said. "Where are the other attendants? The tall guy and the others?" She paused, a slight frown creasing her forehead, as if my question confused her. "I'm sorry, sir, I'm not sure what you mean," she said, her voice steady but distant. "It's just me and Sarah on this flight." Her words hung in the air for a moment, and a cold ripple of unease passed through me. I opened my mouth to correct her, but something about the blank expression in her eyes made me stop. It wasn't just that she seemed confused. She seemed hollow. Like she was repeating words she didn't entirely understand. Before I could press further, she turned and walked away, disappearing down the aisle. I sat back in my seat, my unease growing. I couldn't have been imagining the other attendants. Could I? I distinctly remembered the tall guy's ponytail, the way he had smiled at me when I boarded. And there had definitely been more than 2 attendants. I wasn't the only one who had noticed either. A few rows ahead of me, I overheard a woman whispering to her seatmate. "Where did that other guy go? I swear there were more of them." Her seatmate just shrugged, equally perplexed. The hours dragged on, and the atmosphere in the cabin shifted from calm to something more tense, more wrong. By the time we were 5 hours into the flight, only 1 flight attendant remained, Sarah, the younger one, who had been working alongside the gray-haired woman. But now she was the only one I could see. The gray-haired woman had vanished as well, just like the others. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the crew had been reassigned mid-flight. Maybe they had gone into some section of the plane I didn't know about. But none of it made sense. Every time I looked at Sarah, she seemed more distant, more detached, her movements slower and more robotic. Her eyes, once warm and friendly, were now dull, unfocused, as if she were moving through the motions of her job, but wasn't really there. People were starting to get anxious. I heard more passengers murmuring to each other, glancing around as they, too, noticed the dwindling crew. A man behind me called out for help, his voice tinged with irritation, but Sarah didn't respond. She just continued down the aisle, her expression vacant, her eyes locked ahead, as if she didn't hear him at all. The plane felt colder. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, suddenly aware of the low hum of the engines, the silence that had settled over the passengers. At some point, I tried asking Sarah what was going on. She had been passing by with the drink cart. But when I looked into her eyes, they were blank, unblinking. It was like she was staring straight through me. Her lips moved, forming some half-hearted apology, but it was as if the words were being pulled from somewhere far away, not coming from her at all. A sharp shiver ran through me. That was when I noticed something else. The passengers around me, they were becoming quieter too. People who had been chattering a few hours ago were now sitting stiffly in their seats, faces pale, eyes glazed over. Some had stopped moving entirely, like they were frozen in place, paralyzed by some invisible force. A man across the aisle, who had been restless and fidgeting earlier, now sat unnervingly still, his eyes wide and unblinking, his mouth slightly open as if caught mid-sentence. I stared at him, heart pounding, and realized I couldn't hear him breathing. The hours ticked by and the cabin felt more and more like a tomb. By the time we began our descent, the only one left moving was Sarah. The rest of the passengers, at least half of them, were slumped in their seats, pale and unmoving. The man across the aisle hadn't blinked in hours. His chest didn't rise or fall. His lips had turned an unsettling shade of blue. My mind raced, scrambling for an explanation. Was it a gas leak? Some kind of chemical exposure? How could people just freeze like that? And the crew, where had they gone? I couldn't shake the memory of the 5 attendants at the start of the flight. I wasn't wrong. I wasn't imagining it. And yet here we were, with only one left. As the plane touched down, a wave of relief swept over me. But that relief was short-lived. The passengers still hadn't moved. their bodies rigid and lifeless in their seats. My breath came in short gasps as I stared at them, terrified of what I might see if I got too close. The cabin doors opened with a hiss, and Sarah, the last flight attendant, stood near the exit. Her eyes were blank, her face drained of color. She didn't say a word, didn't make eye contact with anyone as she stepped off the plane and walked into the terminal. Except she didn't walk into the terminal. She stepped onto the jet bridge, and before my very eyes she vanished. There was no dramatic puff of smoke, no flickering, just nothing. She was there, and then she wasn't. One moment she had been a figure in a crisp uniform, and the next she had melted into thin air. I stumbled off the plane, my legs shaky, my head spinning. The airport staff greeted us as if nothing was wrong, as if half the passengers weren't frozen in their seats, their faces drained of life. No one seemed to notice that the flight attendants had vanished into nothingness. I rushed through the terminal, my mind still reeling. I needed answers, anything that could explain what had happened. But as I reached the bustling crowds of the airport, something inside me shifted. I could feel it. I could feel myself freezing. The weight in my chest grew heavier. My steps slowed, and in the reflection of a nearby window I saw my own eyes, wide, unblinking blank, just like the others.